Hi, how are you all doing? I hope you're coping with this COVID thing and the lockdown and you're keeping well. And your musicians out there aren't going totally crazy like I've been going, not being able to get out and play. Time flies, doesn't it, from the beginning of the week to the end of the week, and I'm sorry I haven't posted earlier. I was saddened last week to hear that Pete Way, bass player with UFO, had passed on. Pete and I go back way, many, many years to when I first met Pete when I started producing UFO. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And a lot of people have asked me, I think a lot of people don't know, they remember me from 1969 Woodstock, 10 years after gone. And people write and say, what are you doing? Are you doing anything now? You're still playing? And of course, I'm still playing. I'm playing with my band 170 Split. And I did, in fact, have another band, Kick, before that. We released 2 albums too, so I was going. But let's go back to 1971. Spacing Time was released 10 years after. Took a bit of a hiatus, took us time out. We bought our houses in the country, as rock stars generally do. And the band kind of grew apart a little bit. We had tremendous success around that period and after that. And it did have an effect on the band. As you probably read, Alvin didn't like to go out and tour that much, and things got a little bit edgy in the band, let's say that, and I'm not blaming anybody for it, but they did. But we were kind of separated a little bit. Now, I was interested in recording all the time, always have been, and I carried on doing little projects. I had my home studio, and I think the first real thing I did for a record company was I did some demos with Frankie Miller. Frankie's a great singer if you want to check out his stuff, his songs, and I did that. Eventually Frankie got signed to Chrysalis Records, but when I was working for them, he'd just come down to the UK, or London if you like, from Scotland. So I was doing those recordings for Frankie, and that kind of was his demos and my demo as a record producer and engineer. And I was Chrysalis had signed, that was the 10 years after record company. Chrysalis Records had the option of signing UFO. UFO were a band that had had a little bit of success with a sort of a spacey kind of record in Germany. And I was asked if I might be interested in doing some work with them. And I think one of the appeals for the record company was that I worked cheap. I didn't get paid that much money. Who knows? Difficult to say. But they asked me, would I be interested in doing something with UFO? So I said, yeah, sure. So they said, well, okay, we'll give you a day in the studio, or 3 hours in the studio. So they gave me 3 hours in the studio. This would be 1961, I guess. I have to look at my notes here. Time flies, doesn't it? 1961, 1973. So they asked me if I'd be interested in doing something with UFO, and this would be 1973. I was living in Oxfordshire at the time, near Chipping Norton, where Chipping Norton Studios were, which was a studio run by Mike and Richard Verton, Blue Horizon label, Fleetwood Mac, Albatross, and all that kind of thing. Of course, Mike used to be the 10 years after producer in the early days, so I said, yeah, sure, I'll book 3 hours in Chipping Norton Studios. And I booked the 3 hours. Well, the band turned up an hour late of my 3 hour thing, but we managed to, we did a song called Give Her the Gun, which was released. I'm not sure whether my version of it was released or whether an earlier version of it was released. I have to check with the record label on that, but either way, we did the record, and the band headed off to the ferry to go off on tour. Well, I'd been left 2 hours to make the record and mix and finish it, and I wasn't happy with the mix. So the next day, I booked an hour myself, went back in the studio with engineer Dave Grinstead, and Dave Grinstead is another interesting note of how things go round. Dave was the assistant engineer on 2 of the early 10 years after albums. Dave was now chief engineer at Chipping Norton Studio. So we went in and remixed it, turned it into the record company. They liked it. shortly after that, I got a phone call. I think it was actually from Phil Mogg saying, yeah, we liked it in the studio. We'd like you to produce us. So that was it. And we set off on to do Phenomenon, which I started recording, I think, 1974, early 74. At the same time that we were recording Phenomenon, we'd gone back in the studio to do the 10 years after record Positive Vibrations. So it was a rather strange thing for me, because Positive Vibrations was at a time when 10 years after weren't exactly cohesive. We'd all gone separate ways. It had become less of a cooperative band. Alvin had got his own studio, and he wanted to do everything his way, etc., etc. And that's his choice. I'm not having a bitch about that. But it hit me at a time when I felt I wanted to do something more. I wanted a more of a creative outlet. I didn't want to be waiting around on someone else's beck and call. So I took the job, and the record company said to me, this was the brief, if you can believe it. Well, they sell a few records in Germany, only we don't expect that much, but you can do it. And as I say, if we work cheap, we'll give you 10 days in the studio, which at that time was £150 a day. So it's £1,500. Go in, make a record. And I jumped at it, and I decided we'd record at Morgan Studios in Willesden. It's where 10 years after did the Shush record. Not in the same studio, but at the same recording complex. So I did a bit of pre-production with the guys there. Schenker just joined them. Schenker was 18 years old, I guess, and didn't speak English that well, but my schoolboy German came in handy, so that was good. I quickly found out that UFO were between Phil Mogg and Pete Way, they were a pretty close knitted duo, and everyone else was the butt of their jokes, including Michael and Andy Parker, the drummer. I immediately hit it off with the band. I think, in particular, Pete. Pete had he was a crazy guy, don't get me wrong. He drank an awful lot. He probably talks about it in his book. I haven't read it, but he did have some very strange tales to tell. I mean, if he turned up late for a session, for example, it wouldn't be sorry I'm late, I overslept, or this. It would be, I was on my way to the recording studio, and I was waiting to get on my bus, and then this 87-year-old lady fell off the step of the bus and broke her leg, and I took her to the hospital, and I stayed with the hospital with her till her daughter arrived, etc., etc. It could be aliens from outer space, but anyway, I found it quite humorous. That and the interplay between Phil and Pete was funny, and they were great guys. And what I must say before I go on is that I think that Phil Mogg is an incredible rock singer and lyricist. And Andy Parker, an underrated drummer. Schenker, everybody praises Schenker's playing. Schenker was a brilliant player, even at the age of 18, was a fantastic player. And now I read somewhere someone saying, oh, Pete's not really a great bass player. Well, let me just say, there are bass players and bass players. There's Jaco Pastorius and there's Lemmy, and somewhere between the two, I'd say that Pete was a good bass player. If you listen to those early UFO records, his bass is tight. He's a tight player. And that's, he does what he does. And he's the king of Lycra. I mean, he's the heavy metal. For me, the first guy I saw wearing Lycra, the first guy I saw posing, leaping up in the air, etc., etc. Let's go to the recording. Now, you've all seen Pete Way with his big Gibson bass that he flew around, but let me kill the myth here. The 4 records actually, I worked on a Wasted record as well. So I did UFO, Phenomenon, Fawcett, No Heavy Petting, and then I did a Wasted record. And the bass that Pete used on all those records was, you've got it, this one here, the 1962 jazz bass of mine. And he loved playing it. And probably not as good a pose as the big Gibson on Thunderbird on stage, but it sounded good and it was tight. So back to Phenomena. They gave us 10 days to record. I had a couple of days in the rehearsal room routining with them, and then we went in the studio. Well, allowing for 10 days, that gives me 10 songs. If I could do 4 songs a day, that was my thing. 4 days tracking, 2 days vocals and overdub bits. What's that give me? 6 days, and then maybe 4 days mixing, post-production, picking up bits and pieces. So it was tight. We were scheduled, I think originally we were scheduled to go from 10 till 10, but it kind of rolled into 2 till 2. The sessions were quite crazy. And if you can imagine, as a producer, the band didn't always have to be there. So one thing you find, and anybody that's produced a record will realise that when you're tracking, the whole band are there and you track and they get tired and then you knock it on the head. If you're doing a bass overdub or a guitar overdub or a vocal overdub or something like that, the guitar player comes in, does his bit, he goes off, the bass player comes in, he does his bit, the singer comes in, he does his bit. And the people that are there all the time, you've got it, it's the producer and the engineer and the assistant engineer if you're that fortunate. In my case, a lot of the time towards the end of the session, it would be just me working with whoever was left, because the engineer would say, well, actually, I've done the time I've been allotted to do. It's okay if I go home, and I would carry on. I remember one time we were working so hell-bent for leather that I actually fell to sleep on the session and woke up, and I was the only one there. There was a little note saying, we've all gone home. And that's the way it was. And I was driving back from London to a farm that we were living on, my wife and I were living on in Sally, living on in Oxfordshire, which was 2.5 hour drive, I guess, something like that. And some nights it was foggy and I was driving back and sleepy, and almost ran off the road a couple of times. And in the end, I got one of Paul Carter, the guy that used to be my road manager in 10 years after, to come along and be my assistant, be my driver, save my life on many occasions, I'm sure. Sessions did go well. The tracking was good, the band were tight, and I'd kind of... I had an intuitive feeling of what, if it felt good to me, that was the take. And if it didn't feel good, we kept doing it, and the band, at least, fortunately, listened to what I had to say. And we'd keep going till we got the right take. And then I'd say, okay, let's put a rough vocal on. And that's when I started to realise how UFO worked. And Phil would say, well, I haven't written the vocals yet. So what I was doing, in actual fact, was producing backing tracks and getting the vocals at the last minute, which I know when, some years later, when George Martin produced UFO and he realised what was happening, he wasn't too pleased by it. But that was the way it was. With Michael Schenker, Michael's a perfectionist. So you've got two guys that are rock and roll animals, which was Phil and Pete more so than Phil, I think. Michael, who was very, very serious. Andy, who was easygoing, came in, did his job and left. So Michael would practice and practice and practice his solos. So when he came in the next day to overdub his solos, they would be worked out and he would play it. And I'd say, that was fantastic, Michael. And he'd say, for you, maybe. For me, it was shit. And then he'd do it again and again and again and again. And we'd comp the best bits to make one good solo. And would you have to bear in mind in those days that it wasn't computers, it was tape. And you've got to drop in and drop out and drop in and drop out and mix down. So it was quite a what shall I say? You had to concentrate. You couldn't just sit there saying, oh, I've edited it wrong, I'll press undo, because there was no undo button in those days. As far as tape effects went, I think on the second album we got a digital ADT, double track machine, harmonizer. But most of the things on the early records, any delays we wanted, including double tracking, we'd do with a tape machine, reel to reel, and we'd have make some sort of extended tape loop with the pencils extending the distance between the playback head, the record head and the playback head. So we'd make up a run of tape, sometimes not quite round the room, but almost round the room to get the length of delay we wanted. So that's how it went down. Morgan Studios at the time funny enough, the studio that 10 years after recorded Shush in, which was a small studio, was now used as a little restaurant bar, and there'd be people in the bar during those sessions, and the rest of the band, if they were there when I was doing the guitar or the vocals or whatever, they'd be in the bar. And in the bar would be Bonham and, I don't know, Ozzy and people like that. So it was a pretty raucous, lively atmosphere to be going on. Although I didn't see much of it because I was stuck behind a recording console most of the time. But Phenomenon, I was really pleased. And it was really bizarre going from that. We'd probably do 3 or 4 days and the band would go off and do a gig and then back in again. And then I'd be over at Alvin's studio recording Positive Vibrations, which, to be honest, wasn't very positive because I think everybody was doing different things. Alvin was preparing to go out and do a solo tour. Rick was running a publishing company, and Chick, I think, was playing golf most of the time. Although he did go on to work as a publisher. I'm not quite sure whether he was doing that quite then. But it was really weird going from one record to the other, and being in charge of one record and being frustrated at working on the other. But that's the way it was. So we finished Phenomenon, and I turned it in, and the record company, I think they felt that it was better than what they expected it to be, and they put it out, and it started to have some success, particularly in America. It started to hit in America. I remember getting a call from Warner Brothers in America. No, Jerry Moss, actually, saying, congratulations on your record. Yeah, I think you've got a good career here. Come on over. But I didn't. One of those things, one of those opportune moments where you either take it or you don't. Although there wasn't much pressure from 10 years after management for me to move away from doing what I was doing with 10 years after. So I took the easy option and did nothing with it. But the record came out and it started to happen, and it was doing really well. And then they released. We went in the studio again, and we did Force It. Again, that came out in America and it started to happen. And I got a phone call from the record company saying it's charting, it's happening. And 10 years after, we were on tour at that time, doing we were doing the 75 tour, the final 10 years after tour before a reunion tour. And I was doing radio interviews for the UFO record. And the original guy, the head of the regional sales guy, said to me, I said, it's doing great, it's rising up the charts. And he said to me, it is, yeah, but we didn't expect it to happen. We didn't press enough. So it's going to sell out in the shops. When it sells out in the shops, the radio stations will stop playing it. So it's not going to get any further. And I called up the boss of one of the guys in the record company in London, the UK, and he said, yeah, we fucked up there. And I thought to myself, this is one of those things that happens with bands because of a business, I would say it's a screw up, a lack of foresight, lack of confidence in something. You can lose your impetus on a record run immediately because somebody doesn't do the right promotion, the right advertising, or in this case, press up enough records to get them in the stores. So I think that was rather unfortunate for UFO that they were on a roll, right from almost like a UFO song, isn't it? They were on a roll from those first 2 records, but it didn't take off the way that I thought it would. I had every confidence in the band. I thought the band were great. I loved, as I say, I loved the way that they played. I loved the way that Phil Muggs sang. And I got on really well with them. Pete Way, for years, Pete and I kept in touch. He'd come down to have the farm in Bucks Green with him and his wife, Jo, and stay with us. And it's true about drinking. He did drink. If you don't leave your booze out. If Pete Way ever came to visit you, make sure your best booze is buried in the garden because he will drink it. I remember I was collecting wine at the time. I had a case of 1962 Chateau Latour, which these days I don't know what it would cost you for a bottle, £500 maybe, $500, I don't know. I gave Pete a glass. I thought, here you are, Pete, listen to this. This is super this is superb wine, have a drink of this. And he was on the phone at the time, and I gave him the glass, and he just went, whoop. And I thought, God, he would drink anything. I mean, we made, Sally, my wife and I, we had to go up making homemade wine. We made some marrow wine. Well, the marrow rum was okay. The marrow wine was, I won't say it was like dog's piss, but it was pretty awful. It stank awful, tasted awful, but it was in the wine cellar. Well, down comes Pete. Can I have a glass of this wine? Pete, yeah, sure. Well, he drank the whole bottle. He must have drank about 8 bottles of this disgusting stuff. I've seen it after a party, when people have a party and they leave beer and glasses and this, that and the other. He would come down to breakfast in the morning and fill his glass from what was left over and knock it back for breakfast. So he had quite a he was the archetypical rock and roll musician, if you like. The one, the Ozzy Osbourne of the bass, I suppose you could say. But he was a wonderful guy, wonderful, fun character. I don't think I would. I think it would have been, if you had to work with him in the band, or be married to him even. I don't know, but it could be frustrating. But we had many a laugh together, and may he rest in peace. So that was it. I could go on and talk about the other 2 records and one thing and another, but I enjoyed it. But we did the 3rd record, and the 3rd record, as I say, had lost a little bit of impetus. And the record company, the Chrysalis that we were with, had become international at that time, and they're thinking to themselves, well, if we need to break into the American market, we need to get an American producer, and they did. And they upped the budget because they realised there was potential in UFO. They upped the budget, they upped the tour support. And the A&R man, Chrysalis A&R man at the time said to me, you know what, Leo, the cocaine budget for the record, that it was more than what we gave you to do the records. so they did. And they've done 14 albums now and done incredibly well. And I still stay in touch with them, although I haven't seen them for a few years. But it was great fun working with them. I felt privileged to work with them, and I had some great times. And when it came together in the studio, that is a wonderful feeling. Shortly after I finished producing them, and they were working on the next record, which I don't remember what it was called, but the next one after the one I finished with, they contacted me and asked me if I would manage the band. And I 10 years after, we were doing nothing at the time. And I thought, yeah, okay, I'll manage you. So I went to the record company, and the first thing I asked was, how much money do they have? Are they in debt? Are they okay? And the head of finance said to me, yeah, they're fine, they're about even. That's okay, that's good. And I thought, fine, okay, we're off to a good start. And I looked at the band's contract, and the contract they had was pretty awful. They were on such a poor deal that had they had a huge hit, they'd have gone in for the money, and there wouldn't have been any, and the band would have broken up. And I persuaded the record company to see the sense in that, and they agreed. So I renegotiated the record deal for them for a slightly fairer deal. And then I got stuck into the band, and then the band we're all living in rented cottages here and there, and leasing cars, and one thing and another. And I thought, this is a little weird. And then eventually I got the accounts back from the record company, who at the time were the agents and the management, and they were down. I won't say the figure, because in today's numbers it was, it won't make any sense, but they were down by so much money. It was unbelievable. And I knew that certain members of the band, particularly those, Schenker was not that happy because he wasn't getting his right publishing, because that was being swallowed up by the huge advances and debts they were running into. So a week into managing the band, I guess it would be, once I'd got the information, I called the band together and I said, look, here's the deal. You've got to put your feet on the ground. Otherwise, you're going to run up a huge debt, and the record company are going to drop you, and then you're not going to get anywhere. And you're about to go out you went out on the last tour of Germany, and you hired three BMWs and 3 drivers to drive around. Why can't you drive around in a van? So Pete Way said to me, well, we feel like we were Wimpy. We were working for Wimpy. Wimpy's a building firm. So they weren't too happy about that. And I said, well, look, if I'm going to and the tour manager was coming up to me with, oh, there's this debt for a dental bill and this debt for renting this car, and this guy's behind in his rent for his Muse cottage. And I thought, I'm on a hiding for nothing here as a manager. So I said to the guys, look, you put your feet on the ground and you do what I suggest you do. Otherwise, I'm not going to manage you, and I'll give you a week to think about it, and then we'll decide where we go forwards on this. And I think about 3 days into that, I got a call from Pete Way saying, oh, we've decided that we don't want you to manage us. And I think that's probably one of the best things that UFO ever did for me, because I would have been stupid enough to have carried on and fought their cause. But, you know, subsequently, we still remain friends. Pete came to visit me, and I did produce the Wasted album sometime after that. And that's my story of UFO, and there are millions of short stories, and I'm sure they're in UFO's book and in Pete's book. And no doubt they'll be in my book. But that's how I started working as a record producer, and it went on from there. And that was at the time when 10 years after was kind of coming to an end in 1975. And I'm still in the business. So those of you that still write to me saying, are you still playing? What are you doing now? I remember 1970. I'm still doing it. And I remember 1972, but I missed 2020. I'd like to get out there and do some playing. So take care, everyone. R.I.P. Pete Way. Best wishes to all you musicians out there. Keep on playing, because remember, listening to music is food for the soul, and that's what's getting me through, just listening to music and, as I say, playing along with it. So take care, everyone. Speak to you soon.